Okay, so for this class, we're going to talk about rights. Last class, we talked about social movements and how these movements have been formed to gain greater access to rights, to correct violations of people's rights. So this class will spend a little bit more time talking about the idea of rights themselves. Now, what do we mean by rights? It's a notoriously ambiguous term. It could be defined in lots of different ways. Basically, if you talk about the idea of human rights, which is a very sort of expansive concept, as it says here, those basic standards which are necessary for a life of dignity and their universality is derived from the fact that in this respect, at least, all humans are equal. We should not and cannot discriminate between them. This is from the Council of Europe. And obviously, the notion of rights, has taken on a kind of global significance. But basically, it's the idea of what are sort of, as it says here, the basic standards for a dignified human life. Now, even that is somewhat of an ambiguous concept, right? And you can expand that or go in various different directions with that. Does housing and education are those necessary things for a life of dignity? Many people would say yes, but apparently in the United States, these are not actually considered human rights. So when we turn now to the essays by um, Marshall and the others, they kind of split rights into three different categories: civil rights, political rights, and social rights. Marshall kind of starts this idea, Mann and Tilly kind of expand upon it. Basically, what Marshall does is that he looks at the evolution of rights in the United Kingdom. And then Mann especially sort of takes this concept and says, well, all right, let's now look at the evolution of rights in different countries. Not all countries obviously follow the same path of development as you saw in the United Kingdom, but they all sort of agree on this tripartite categorization of civil, political, and social rights. So that'll be kind of the framework that we adopt here. So, of course, the logical place to start is with civil rights. So let me just move this over so you can see a little bit better. Or sorry, I can see a little bit better at least. All right. So the basic idea of civil rights is that they are necessary for individual freedom, individual liberty, freedom of speech, thought, and faith, the right to own property and to conclude valid contracts, and the right to justice. Now, the last of these, the right to justice, is a little bit different because it presumes the ability to defend your rights on equal terms and under due process of law. Civil rights are then closely tied to institutions like the courts and the legal system. Basically, what they do is they give you, protection both from the power of the government and basically protection from other people as well. They sort of create a zone of sort of non-interference where people basically cannot, interfere with you, mess with you, basically. But they're very, in another sense, kind of minimal. In the U.S., of course, they are found in the Bill of Rights and in additional amendments to the Constitution, or at least that's kind of the foundation of civil rights here in the United States. According to Marshall, civil rights are also very important for the development of a capitalist economy as well. As he writes here, civil rights were indispensable to a competitive market economy. They gave to each man, as part of his independent status, the power to engage as an independent unit in the economic struggle and made it possible to deny him social protection on the ground that he was equipped with the means to protect himself. So the idea is kind of that if you have a basic foundation of civil rights, you basically have all the tools that you need uh, to make something of yourself. No other. So there's kind of like a double edged sword to civil rights because you have, in theory at least, a foundation of freedom basically from which you can act upon. You don't require any other assistance from the state or from any other entity. So it's this kind of sink or swim. You sort of rise on the basis of your own merits or not. And of course, obviously, an important aspect of civil rights is the right to own property, as it says here. So it also sets up the basis for, sort of the legal foundation for property ownership, including, ownership over the so-called, the now famous means of production, as Marx and Engels would call it. Now, of course, last class we talked about the civil rights movement. I would actually argue that the civil rights movement probably should more accurately be called the civil, political, and social rights movement, because as we will see, it was really a movement for all of these things. Although, of course, the idea of civil rights was foundational in many ways. But again, even at a very early point, the struggle to gain the right to vote was closely tied up with the idea of civil rights. And then as the civil rights movement sort of evolves, especially in the latter years, it increasingly took on this, characteristic of fighting for greater, social rights, economic protections, basically. The most famous aspect of civil rights in the United States, of course, is the First Amendment. Now, I believe everyone has read this already, but I guess it's worth reading it out here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. These come to be known as the five freedoms of the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly, meaning, protest, basically, and petition. I believe, famously, Amy Coney Barrett, when she was being questioned on her Supreme Court appointment, was not able to name these five freedoms, by the way. Then you turn to the Fifth Amendment, particularly this idea of due process of law, again, which we've already kind of covered when we went over the Constitution, but this idea that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, meaning that, again, you follow a clearly defined legal process before any of these things can be taken away from people. This is expanded in the 14th Amendment as well, which we'll also cover in more detail, now basically extending this idea to the states as well. When we cover the Supreme Court, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the 14th Amendment, because it's actually extremely important to the Supreme Court. I don't believe any amendment has been cited more by the Supreme Court than actually the 14th Amendment. So I'll sort of save a little bit of that from when we get to talk about the Supreme Court. But I think everyone has a sort of a basic understanding of what civil rights are. Again, we've already talked about it to some extent. Now I'd like to turn to the idea of political rights. Basically, the right to participate in the exercise of political power. That means, of course, holding office or even just the ability to vote is an important political right. So right off the bat, I think that would serve as, I would assume maybe that most people kind of assume that voting is just another, civil right. And I suppose maybe you could make that argument. But for, analytical purposes, perhaps it is necessary to separate the right to vote, political rights, from civil rights. They are kind of different if you think about it. Voting, implies a kind of positive action, whereas civil rights, to use a well-known essay in political theory, civil rights are more about what people call a kind of negative freedom or negative liberty. It's the idea of setting limits basically on what the government can do or what other people can do. It's basically saying, no, you cannot do these things. That's why they call it basically negative liberty. Like it says, you cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That is setting a sort of negative limit on what the government can do. It's basically saying no to the government, essentially. Voting is a positive action. It's basically saying yes. It's like yes, you can do this. There was a famous essay written in the 1950s by a political theorist, Isaiah Berlin, who basically separated the concept of liberty into both negative liberty and positive liberty. And so then, voting and political rights would fall more into the idea of so-called positive liberty. According to Marshall, and I think this is true, civil rights without political power to back it up is very insecure. In other words, in theory, you might have civil rights to protect your individual freedom, but if you have no influence, if you have no say in what the government does, doesn't that become a very sort of insecure foundation? I mean, what's to prevent? As we've seen, there are any number of examples of governments flagrantly, violating a person's civil rights while claiming, of course, that they are not, or sort, using some convoluted legal justification to act as if they are in fact not violating a person's civil rights, including spying, detaining people, banning things, censorship. Of course, yeah, as we're talking right now, there's a major censorship issue in front of the Supreme Court right now regarding TikTok, for example, which the Supreme Court seems to be leaning towards the idea that somehow banning TikTok is not a violation of people's freedom of speech, even though there's like over 100 million people that use it basically as a social media platform. Anyway, so martial rights here, the political rights of citizenship, unlike the civil rights, were full of potential danger to the capitalist system, although those who were cautiously extending them down to the social scale probably did not realize how great the danger was. They could hardly be expected to foresee what vast changes could be brought about by the peaceful use of political power without a violent and bloody revolution. So this is very much reminiscent of the quote from Engels that I read out last class, that at a certain point, the bourgeoisie became more alarmed of the legal actions of the proletariat rather than their illegal actions. The idea that the proletariat could actually use sort of legally, defined political rights, basically, to pursue their goals rather than sort of illegal actions. Turning it back to the United States, especially during the abolition movement and during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, the idea of providing voting rights to the former slaves was of the utmost importance. And as we know, obviously, looking at the civil rights movement, it was not successful. It was for a period of time, but then as the 19th century wore on, basically, governments started passing laws that basically took away the right from African Americans, which again, if you remember the Constitution, voting rights are mostly left to the states. The federal government, the Constitution does not really have clearly define voting rights for people. Anyway, this is I'll read a couple of quotes here from important abolitionists and people important in the Reconstruction movement. Wendell Phillips, who was one of the most important abolitionists, writes here: "Our philosophy of government since the 4th day of July, 1776, is that no class is safe, no freedom is real, no emancipation is effectual, which does not place in the hands of man himself the power to protect his own rights. As an abolitionist under such a government, I fall back on the democratic principle and claim of the anti-slavery party that it shall be content with no emancipation which does not put into the hands of the freedman himself," freedmen being the term used for former slaves, "the freedman himself the power to protect his newly acquired liberty." Applause. That's not for you to applaud. This is taken from a speech, obviously. "No emancipation is effectual, no freedom is real, which does not take that shape. I argue it simply as a question of security, not of justice or magnanimity. For a nation to ask a man to fight for them and then leave them without full citizenship is an infamy which would make a man forswear all part in such a nation." Frederick Douglass also speaks to this. "I am for the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the black man." Notice he doesn't say women, by the way, "in every state in the Union. Without this, his liberty is a mockery. Without this, you might as well retain the old name of slavery for his condition. For in fact, if he is not the slave of the individual master, he is the slave of society and holds his liberty as a privilege, not as a right. He is at the mercy of the mob and has no means of protecting himself." Charles Sumner, another important abolitionist figure, and a member of Congress. "I begin by expressing a heartfelt aspiration that the day may soon come when the states lately in rebellion may be received again into the co-partnership of political power and the full fellowship of the Union. But I see too well that it is vain to expect this day, which is so much longed for, until we have obtained that security for the future which is found only in the equal rights of all, whether in the courtroom or at the ballot box." So notice the notion of the courtroom kind of refers more to civil rights. The ballot box obviously refers more to voting rights. "This is the great guarantee without which all other guarantees will fail. This is the sole solution of our present troubles and anxieties. This is the only sufficient assurance of peace and reconciliation. So I think, quite clear here, the arguments made for, again, why civil rights are really, in a sense, kind of meaningless without political rights to back it up. And of course, we see the, historical long struggle to, achieve, uh, political rights for former, slaves. And then, of course, in the civil rights era for Black people living under segregation in the South. And we see, of course, how hard the status quo basically fought against granting those rights. That was actually what set John Wilkes Booth off to kill. What drove him over the edge, actually, to assassinate Lincoln. It wasn't just the fact that slavery was coming to an end. It was the idea that Lincoln had, slowly and reluctantly maybe come around to the idea of, yes, we have to give, voting rights to the former slaves. Without it, basically, as I've already, pointed out, it'll be meaningless. So I think the argument for the connection between social and political rights is quite clear. You can see I've included a couple of other quotes here. I'm not going to read all this because it gets to be a bit much. I just want to see if there's anything in particular that stands out. No, not really. Then turning to Thaddeus Stevens, most of these quotes are taken from Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, written in the 1930s. But even during the Reconstruction era, you can see that even here, the idea of social rights enters into the picture. So, of course, you have to provide civil rights for the former slaves. You have to provide for political rights for the former slaves. But you also need to provide economic support as well. So I'm not going to read all this. I'll just read the second, somewhat long quote. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, and it never can be done if this opportunity is lost. How can Republican institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse exist in a mingled community of nabobs and serfs, of the owners of 20,000-acre manors with lordly palaces and the occupants of narrow huts inhabited by low white trash? This is Thaddeus Stevens, who was known as one of the preeminent radical Republicans during this period of time. People who were very radically committed to the idea of Reconstruction. If the South is ever to be made a safe republic, let her lands be cultivated by the toil of the owners of by the owners or the free labor of intelligent citizens. This must be done even though it derives her nobility into exile, meaning the slave masters. If they go, all the better. It will be hard to persuade the owner of 10,000 acres of land who drives a coach and four that he's not degraded by sitting at the same table or in the same pew with the embrowned and hard-handed farmer who has himself cultivated his thriving homestead of 150 acres. The whole country, the country will be well rid of the proud, bloated, and defiant rebels. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure have been spent in vain. And he was right, of course, but they did not succeed in that. And within a couple of decades, basically, yes, the South essentially regressed into essentially another form of slavery under the guise of segregation. But what he was basically saying here is that yes, it's not just enough to provide civil rights and political rights. You have to also provide land. You have to provide an economic means of living to the former slaves. And in fact was in favor of the idea of basically, taking the land of the slave owners and redistributing it to the slaves. Something which Du Bois points out is very much what you would see, in a socialist, a so-called, socialist revolution, like in, Russia or China or Cuba or wherever, where one of the first things that the revolutionary government does is to take the land from the large landowners and dole it out basically to the people there. Now, again, you can see that the struggle to gain the right to vote is not, limited in the United States. In the United Kingdom, for example, there was a movement known as the Chartist movement, which fought very hard, to gain, working class people the right to vote in the United Kingdom. You can see here it was not really until the 20th century where um, it wasn't until 1918 that 100% of men basically had the right to vote. And not until 1929 where all men and women got the right to vote. So even later in the United Kingdom than it was in the United States did women gain the right to vote. And I think, it's quite clear that the idea of, voting, in the 19th century, they used to call it bourgeois uh, democracy. And some people still use that term now, right? It's the idea, yes, it's a democratic government. People vote, um, but it's basically limited to the people that own property. And you can see, in many countries, this, limitation of voting rights to property ownership was practiced basically throughout most of the 19th century in many instances. In the United States, property ownership being tied to the right to vote was eliminated fairly early on. It did exist at some point, but was eliminated fairly early on. But of course, as we know, um, the right to vote was also, excluded from blacks living in the United States, or, whether they were slaves or not. Women were not allowed to vote, and like I said, Native Americans were not allowed to vote either. So, of course, since the 1960s, the right to vote has been somewhat secured, although, parts of the Voting Rights Act have been overturned by the Supreme Court. And almost as soon, basically the parts that would allow for the federal government to basically, supervise or, oversee um, elections or, election laws passed in many of the southern states. As soon as those restrictions on southern states were overturned, many states have, in very short time, gone to work passing laws, so-called voter suppression laws, making it harder to vote. And of course, these things are generally, targeted at poorer people, and unfortunately, disproportionately, that means many Black Americans, particularly those living in the South. I would add. So, again, you can see over the last decade or so, many states, the states highlighted in red here, basically, have said about, basically passing laws making it harder to vote. And another aspect to this is the idea of state felon voting laws as well. So many states also take away the right to vote if you've been convicted of a crime. You can see here the states highlighted in orange. You could basically lose your right to vote permanently if you've ever been convicted of a crime. Many states restrict, basically take away the right to vote if you are in prison, but also if you're on parole or probation as well. So you could be out of prison living on the streets or, living, uh, at home or wherever, but still not have the right to vote while the term of your, parole or probation is still in effect, which, for many people could be many years. And of course, given the class-based and, racist criminal justice system that we have here in the United States, obviously those laws, once again, disproportionately fall on Black people as well. So Piven and Cloward have also written books on this topic. In fact, two books: "Why Americans Don't Vote," the sequel, "Why Americans Still Don't Vote," and they, they highlight various, means, basically, how states create all these legal barriers, particularly to make it harder for poor people to vote in the United States. So it's hard to register to vote. There are all these, arbitrary cutoff dates and things like that. Polling places. This is a significant issue that I think a lot of people have focused attention on. The lack of polling places to go to. Some people have to drive very far, wait online for hours, and in some cases to vote. The voter ID requirements. Of course, most people have to work on election days. So, if you're a person, holding down a job, or in many cases holding down several jobs, it can be very hard to find time to vote. Purging voter rolls, basically throwing people off the registered voter list if you did not, vote in a certain period of time. There were some irregular things that happened. For example, I remember during the 2016 primary, many people who want to vote in the Democratic primary, when it's down to Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, were not allowed to vote. That was, reported on by some media outlets. I actually spoke to several students that said that actually happened to them. In fact, that they were registered to vote, but when they went to the polling place, they were told that they were not allowed to vote, basically, which is kind of strange, to be honest. And various other things. I won't go through all of them, but as you can see, there are quite a number of obstacles that are thrown out, basically, to make it harder for people to vote. So I guess one of the sort of takeaways from this class is that none of these rights are really all that secure. Our civil rights are not entirely secure, especially because of things that have happened, especially since the war on terror, the Patriot Act, and things like that. Again, the government, spying powers. It's funny enough, going back to the TikTok thing. We're being told that the Chinese government is spying on us and things like that, even though there's literally no evidence to support that claim. But at the same time, around the same time, the government, the Congress has once again, reauthorized the laws that allow the government to spy on people, basically, in this country. So I would argue we have a lot more to worry about our own government spying on us than we do with the Chinese government, for example. So now we turn to the idea of social rights, and this is where things get, at least in the case of the United States, a little more complicated, you could say. Social rights, which include things like healthcare, education, housing, a basic income, maybe in some instances, are much more controversial in the United States than they are in many other countries. Most other countries, in fact, is not really a controversial thing. But in the US, it is. In fact, none of these things are considered rights. So when we looked at FDR's economic bill of rights, I did not really go over it in class, but it was one that, the readings I assigned, I know many people wrote about it. The clear intention there was that these things should be codified as constitutional rights. They should be added basically to the Constitution as additional rights. I mean, why else would you call it an economic bill of rights? To date, none of these things have, none of the things that FDR mentions have been included as constitutional rights. Even things like social security. I mean, we have social security, obviously, right now, at least. But that's not a constitutional right. It doesn't say, like, in the Constitution that we have a right to social security. So keep that in mind. Now, Marshall ties the extension of social rights to political rights. That's sort of the logical outcome of political rights is to lead to greater social rights, as he writes here. But the normal method of establishing social rights is by the exercise of political power. For social rights imply an absolute right to a certain standard of civilization, which is conditional only on the discharge of the general duties of citizenship. Their content does not depend on the economic value of the individual claimant. Basically, what he's saying is that once you give working class people the right to vote, of course, they're going to use that political power to press for greater social rights, to press for laws which will guarantee social rights to them. I think that's fairly obvious. And in many ways, the development of social rights also follows the development of capitalism. Of course, as people are, exposed to the economic vulnerabilities of the capitalist system, the poverty, the inequality created. Of course, they're going to, pressure the government to, provide economic guarantees for those things. So when we talk about there is something known as the International Bill of Human Rights. It includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which the United States did sign and ratify. But there are two additional documents, one known as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and one known as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Basically, economic, social, and cultural rights are basically just what we would call social rights. Now, it's interesting that the United States signed and ratified the first covenant on civil and political rights, but has not ratified the covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. It was signed, in fact, by President Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s, but it was not ratified by the Senate, which, of course, again, as it says in the Constitution, treaties basically have to be ratified by the Senate. The greatest extension of social rights even if it's not, codified in the Constitution, occurred between the 1930s and the 1970s. Many of these, of course, were created by the New Deal, including Social Security, unemployment, welfare, and other aspects. Medicare and Medicaid were created in the 1960s. Um, Also, for many years, you had free college education in the United States, or you at least had tuition-free colleges. Maybe there were some other, fees that you had to pay, but most public colleges were basically tuition free, like the CUNY system, or the SUNY system, or the University of California system. Interestingly enough, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California in the late 1960s, basically he one of his advisors said that part of the reason why they wanted to introduce tuition, which they did do, by the way, during that period of time, is that he wanted to prevent what he called an educated proletariat from forming in the United States. He believed this would create significant social discontent. Which is probably true, but I mean, basically saying that yes, you don't want the working class in this country to have an education. You don't want them to actually know what's going on, basically, because then they'll be very upset, obviously, at the way things are. So one way you could think of the idea of social rights is they are attempts to de-commodify certain, um, you know, aspects of human life, healthcare, housing, things like that. So according to Esping Anderson in his book, The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, decommodification refers to the extent to which individuals and families can maintain a normal and socially acceptable standard of living regardless of market performance. So again, it's the idea of taking these things out of the market, that it does not rely upon people's income level and their ability to pay for these things. The wealth that they have accumulated should not be tied to your ability to receive health care, or not be homeless, basically. The opposite to it, to commodify something, is to transform inalienable, free, or gifted things, objects, services, ideas, nature, personal information, people, or animals into commodities or objects for sale. So to commodify something means to take something that used to be free, and turn it into something that you sell. Or in other words, for things like healthcare and housing, is to take these things and to turn them into for-profit, businesses, basically, to turn the provision of healthcare into a for-profit industry, which is awful. I can't imagine why anybody could think that that is a good idea. Also, this obviously this notion of commodification derives from Marx as well. I mean, this is literally like chapter one of the first volume of Capital. So I think it also shows you why his Marxist theory is still important today, because this concept of the commodity and the central role that it plays in modern day society is essential for understanding so much of what is going on. Now, of course, in the United States, we do commodify food, housing, and healthcare, and much to the detriment of people. So, according to a couple of sources here, in the United States, people waste about 92 billion pounds of food annually, equal to 145 billion meals. They throw away over 473 billion worth of food annually. Shockingly, they waste 38% of all the food in America. This is from Feeding America. Um, So it's a tremendous amount of food. Yet there are people that are hungry, that are insecure, that don't have proper access to nutrition. We actually subsidize junk food in this country. I often hear people say, well, people are unhealthy because of the food they eat, and they don't make good choices and things like that. I mean, that's probably true to a certain extent, but a lot of it is probably due to the fact that it's hard. It puts an economic strain on people to eat healthy. It costs a lot of money to eat healthy. Go to the grocery store and you can see it. You want to drink almond milk instead of regular milk, it's going to cost more money. You want to use vegan butter instead of regular butter, it's going to cost more money, basically. And even with that, I mean, even if you eat fruits and vegetables, and eat the things that you're supposed to be eating, I mean, you have to worry about the lead content in the soil and the pesticides that people are using and things like that. So I think to say that people are unhealthy because of the food that they eat, and purely making it their own fault, I think is a bit of a simplification to say the very least. I think there's a lot more that goes into that. It's actually very hard to eat healthy in this country, both for economic reasons and frankly because of the poor quality of regulation of food in this country as well, and the fact that we've let things like the soil get contaminated to such an extent. They have to worry about lead in the soil and stuff like that. But anyway, I mean, besides that, we have an enormous amount of food. We waste so much food that there's no reason why anybody should have to go hungry in this country at all. Now going back to what Marx and Engels said, Marx and Engels believed, especially later on in their lives, that in order to have a socialist revolution, basically two things are necessary, right? One, the productive capacity of the society has to be developed to a very high extent. The other aspect is that the working class has to be educated sufficiently to want a revolution, basically. As far as the first criteria, the development of the productive forces of society, I mean, that has certainly been accomplished. Why is that a necessary thing? In other words, for socialism, Marx and Engels would say, because you have to have that. You have to have that development of production for socialism to work. I mean, if in theory it's a society where everyone has free access to everything, obviously you need an abundance of things, to allow everybody to have everything. The argument for markets and for prices and things like that is that it's a way to allocate resources. Otherwise, there wouldn't be enough for people. Some people would be hoarding everything, and there wouldn't be enough for everyone to go around. What they're basically saying is that once the productive capacity of society has been developed enough, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about how these things would be allocated. And food, of course, is certainly a great example of that. I mean, there's literally no reason to charge anybody money for food. There's more than enough food to go around for everybody. So that first qualification has certainly been accomplished, at least here in the United States and other wealthy countries. The other part, the education of the working class, that's obviously the big stumbling block here. In other countries, though, like China, for example, or Cuba, that development of production was of course, an important obstacle that had to be overcome, and still is being overcome in many cases as well. Not to get it, into all of that, you could argue then that basically because of that, because those societies, prematurely had a revolution there, they can't properly be called, socialist, which is maybe there's something to that argument. But a lot of it stems from the fact that yes, I mean these were still countries that were extremely poor, did not have the ability to produce enough stuff that could allow for true free access to everybody. Now that's food. That's a pretty basic thing. I also think about the famous book by the anarchist communist Peter Kropotkin. The conquest of bread. So this idea of making sure there's enough food for people to go around. It's kind of an important thing. That's an interesting book, by the way, to read if you haven't read it, and a short read as well. The conquest of bread. Moving on to housing now, another aspect that is central to debates like this. Is there enough housing for people? We have homeless people. We have at least probably 500,000 homeless people in the United States. Probably about 100,000 homeless people just in New York City alone. Although these are estimates, obviously. And we're constantly hearing about the housing shortage and things like that. Well, it turns out there's probably a lot of housing out there also. So according to this headline from the website The City, sort of like a local New York website, New York news website, more than 60,000 rent stabilized apartments are now vacant, and tenant advocates say landlords are holding them for ransom. So there are empty apartments in New York City that are just not being rented out by the landlords because they object to the rent control laws, that they're limited to a certain amount that they can charge for rent. And they're basically, what they're trying to do is they're trying to artificially restrict the supply of housing in order to drive up the price of it, right? As we know in conventional economic wisdom, supply and demand. When the supply of something is more limited, that increases the price for something, or it increases the demand for something by restricting the supply of it. So what these landlords are doing is particularly sinister, I would say, in that they're trying to artificially restrict the supply of housing in order to basically force up the price for it, to basically force the New York City government to agree to rent increases, which they have done, by the way, over the last several years. I mean, what else can you say? I mean, it's a horrible thing to do, obviously. Aside from that, if there is a supply, a lack of affordable housing in other parts of the country, it's because people who build houses, construction companies, are not incentivized to build affordable housing, right? The economic incentives that they get is to build these, luxury condos and very expensive housing that most people cannot afford. Um, and financial interests make a lot of money off of housing as well. According to the economist Michael Hudson, something like 80% of bank loans in this country basically go for mortgages. And if you know how mortgages work, you could see why. I mean, more than if you have a mortgage, whether a 15-year or 30-year mortgage, something like 60 to 70% of what you pay off over that period of time is basically just interest. It's not even the actual cost of the home itself. Most of that money basically just goes to paying off interest on the mortgage. So it's an incredibly lucrative way for banks to make money, basically. And of course, as I've pointed out in prior classes, the so-called FIRE sector of the economy makes up an extremely large sector of the American economy as well. All right, so we've talked about food, we've talked about housing. Both these things are commodified, which have, I would say, severe negative consequences to them. What about healthcare? Another thing that's been in the news a lot lately. So, from a study in 2020, this Yale study says that Medicare for All would save the U.S. $450 billion a year and prevent nearly 70,000 deaths a year, too, from Democracy Now! Now, what they're saying basically is that the lack of health insurance in this country, or what people call underinsured, which I think can be somewhat of a misleading term. Basically, just buy more health insurance and you'll be okay. But the lack of insurance, the lack of proper health insurance in this country, basically causes the deaths of 70,000 people every year. So think about that in light of recent events. I mean, these health insurance companies are killers, and the people that run them are literally, murdering people. Just because they're not doing it in a direct way does not mean, just because they're not going out with a gun and shooting these people does not mean that they are not, in fact, killing these people. They are, making decisions basically that, will end the life of thousands of people in this country every single year. So these people are actually murderers, as you can see. As you can see here, the prices of homes in the United States has continued to go up and up and up. Most people can't afford homes anymore because they're so high. If you're already a homeowner, it's good for you, at least as long as the market doesn't collapse, which it might. I mean, we're very much still within a housing bubble, just like you had, in the run up to 2007, 2008. You can see here that the housing prices are even higher than they were in 2007. So, if anything, we've created an even bigger housing bubble. Does that sound like a sensible solution to dealing with a housing bubble, which played a very critical role in the global financial crash of 2008? To basically reinflate the bubble and create a bigger bubble. But that is literally what governments have done. But like I said, real estate plays a major role in the economy. Now, to the other idea, are rent control laws unconstitutional? So many of these landlords object to this idea. They think that having laws limiting what they can charge for rent is an unconstitutional thing. That is not true. I mean, that's just a blatant lie. Again, the Constitution does say that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So it's not depriving a person necessarily of property. It's not taking away their property, but putting limits on what they can do with their property. It is, you could say, a deprivation. But it says that without due process of law. So do rent control laws follow due process of law? And of course they do. And here are some examples of Supreme Court cases that have actually held up rent control laws. This is just a partial example, and this is just examples from the Supreme Court. So, in short, when landlords complain about things like that, they are just lying, basically. Landlords have had their day in court on a number of occasions, in fact, and basically in almost every instance, courts have ruled that yes, of course, rent control laws are constitutional, but they are not, again, a violation of the notion of due process of law. And other people who complain that it's hard to be a landlord in New York City or elsewhere, well, then stop being a landlord. Who told you that that was the way in which you had to make a living in the world, basically. Although you do see people complaining about this very 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 often, as if we're supposed to feel sorry for the landlords. And I'm sure there are bad tenants. There are also many bad landlords out there. And anyway, I mean, would somebody like to talk about the cost of rent in New York City? I mean, are we supposed to believe that rent is cheap? I mean, I would think that most people who live in New York would tell you that the rents are extremely high, even with rent control in place for the most part, and even rents and home prices in areas surrounding New York City are of course very high as well. Here's a chart, I believe it's from the Boston Globe, probably reprinted in many newspapers. Basically shows you that United Healthcare, and of course, the CEO of United Healthcare was the one who was, shot and killed, had actually the highest rate of insurance claim denials. So they denied more claims for insurance than any other health insurance company. And they're all bad. Let's be clear. But the reason I say that is because they are literally incentivized to deny people health care. The more claims that they deny, the more money that they make. Basically, their whole business model rests on this idea of people paying these increasingly higher premiums for insurance, and then which is how they make their money. But then every time they have to pay out an insurance claim, they lose money. So their incentive, like I said, is to basically, deny people's claims as much as they possibly can. So yes, I mean when this killing of the CEO first happened, there was briefly all of a sudden every politician, every person in the media in the country suddenly became aware of how bad health insurance was. But I noticed that after that initial reaction, it's pretty much regress now to this idea of that, well, what this guy did is horrible. Oh, how could you kill a husband and father? Oh my god, this is the worst thing ever. And I'm not condoning what this guy did. I think it is pretty bad. I think it also speaks to the weakness of American society, that we don't have an organized movement of people, that, like, we literally don't have, as we talked about last class, a social movement to press for healthcare changes, healthcare reforms in this country. And in the lack of that, you have these sort of individual acts, these the sort of vigilante justice, which is meted out this way. I mean, that is not a good substitute, obviously, for having a strong, active social movement of people. But let's be clear. I mean, the guy that got killed was himself a killer, and I will defend that statement against anybody. I mean, he did things, as did other people, obviously, not just him himself, that according to at least one study, kills about 70,000 people every single year in this country. And that study was done in 2020. So just think how many people have died since then. Now, the small amount of social rights that we do have in the United States, and again, none of these things are actually in the Constitution or codified in the Constitution. Almost all of these things were fought for in a process of struggle. So you can see this chart here. Even very minor things that we have, like a weekend, 2 days off during the week, overtime pay, an 8-hour workday as opposed to like a 12 or 15-hour workday, a minimum wage, which of course is extremely low, paid. That I mean that's another thing. People talk about a $15 minimum wage. Do you realize if you average that out over the course of a year, that's only about $30,000 a year? I mean, that's not adequate for most people. And you can't even get that passed basically. Paid vacation days, sick days, um, all of which are basically at the behest of the employer. There is no national guarantee to those things. Many other countries do have that. They have, laws that mandate that all employers have to give their employees a certain number of paid vacation days or sick days. We don't have that in the United States. Safety standards, child labor laws, something which they're actually trying to uh, push back again. Health benefits, unemployment security, I'm sorry, retirement security and unemployment compensation. All these things were fought for in a very vicious struggle against employers, going back to the 19th century and through a good part of the 20th century as well. I mentioned it in my article. It's a citation actually, but there was a presidential commission on violence convened in the late 1960s to study violence in the United States. One of the panels was devoted to labor issues, and that panel concluded that the United States has had the most violent labor struggles of any industrialized country in the world, which is really saying something. Because if you study European history, there's some pretty violent labor struggles there as well. But according to this uh, commission, they pale in comparison to the violence sort of directed against the labor movement here in the United States. So I would just like to point that out because again, even these things as moderate as they are, the idea that people had to fight and die to get an 8-hour workday in this country, I think is pretty extraordinary, obviously. But that is in fact the case. And of course, all of those things are still very insecure now. In fact, many employers have already found ways to kind of, eat away at that and get their employees to work, more than 8 hours a day, obviously. The next few things, I'm not going to go into this too much. I mean, this is just a list. If you want to see, a comparison to what other countries get in terms of sick leave, you can see it here. Paid vacation days, parental leave. So there you go. Now, again, so and I'll start to wrap things up here. Um, but what Mann and Tilly do is basically to take what Marshall does and sort of extend it to other countries as well. So this sort of evolution of civil, political, and social rights. Mann, finds, of course, not every country follow this sort of evolution from civil rights to political rights to social rights. He finds examples of countries, for example, pre-war uh, Germany, World War One, which granted civil and social rights, but not really political rights. Otto von Bismarck, if you ever heard of him, the Chancellor of Prussia and first Chancellor of Germany, was a very crafty politician and basically realized that, yeah, it would be a good way to sort of keep people, you know, passive if the government did grant certain social rights like healthcare and things like that. But political rights were quite limited. Actually, on paper, people did have the right to vote, uh, but the German Reichstag or the parliament basically had no real political power. So all power is basically in the hands of the central government, and that government could basically more or less act as it wished. Then you have examples like the Soviet Union, which and other so-called communist states. I say so-called because I don't think they can. I think they're actually really more what could be considered state capitalist, but that's another topic, I suppose. But they do grant a very extensive social rights. Again, healthcare, education, housing, uh, but no civil or political rights. Civil rights are very insecure. Once again, on paper, people do have the right to vote, but basically, you have one political party that you can vote for, so it kind of makes it meaningless, I guess you could say. Then you have fascist regimes. They basically don't grant any kind of rights. You have no rights there. So I thought that was an interesting sort of expansion of this idea, by looking at other countries as well. The essay by Charles Tilly, basically focuses. Oh, and man, like I said last class, focuses on this idea that rights are always connected to a process of political struggle. That rights are only given out in that the political ruling class of a society basically figures out. All right, well, what do we have to give to people to get them to obey us? And depending on the strength of the movements, depending on the strength of these popular movements, some governments will, give more and some governments will give less. Unfortunately, that does not reflect very well on the United States because it implies basically that people will sort of, trade their obedience. And, I've already mentioned this last class. I don't want to keep rehashing things, but will basically trade their obedience and get very little in return, that they really don't get any kind of real guaranteed social rights or anything like that. But but let's be clear also that social rights are still you know an extension of this idea of a way for the ruling class to remain in power, for a capitalist ruling class to remain in power. We should not fool ourselves into thinking that just because certain countries grant more extensive social rights that they are not at the same time still capitalist countries also, or capitalist societies also. They still are, of course. Tilly also focuses, on a similar idea that rights are usually connected to military struggle. That when which I think also sort of builds upon what Mann is saying. That basically, when the government needs people the most, basically to fight a war, they're more likely to sort of grant these kinds of concessions in exchange for that. And of course, the French Revolution is kind of a famous example of that. Um, okay, so I think I pretty much covered that. I'll probably wrap things up here. You do see, of course, some extension of, yes, citizenship rights during times of war, also within the United States as well. Again, I think the key takeaway from this is this idea of sort of struggle and bargaining. That it's almost like a contract negotiation that the ruling elite sort of play with the people as a whole. Obviously, we're speaking of it in kind of an abstract way, but this idea that yes, the sort of strength and intensity of the struggle by people will sort of determine the extent of the rights to which they are granted. Um, but just because, like I said, they are granted fairly extensive social rights does not mean there's not at the same time still a capitalist, society, because you still have people engaging in wage labor. You still have, the production of commodities. You still have, the profit motive still operates in these societies. It's just that it's a little bit more, limited to some extent. Okay, so I think I will pretty much wrap things up here. Um, and that's it. So, that being said, take care, everyone.